Hi again, and welcome to another lecture. This week we're going to be taking a look at race and class. Last week we looked at language. This week we want to look at class in particular as we look at it in terms of performances, in terms of how things are performed, how they're presented, how they're portrayed. This subtitle is looking at how we went from a black America to the four black Americas, and there's some interesting scholarship recently that's come out on that I'm eager to share with you. And by the end of this lecture, you will know how Eugene Robinson, who's a highly educated and well-regarded Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, has come to classify the range of economic classes in America. Second, you'll come to understand how each class represents different attitudes and interests. And finally, I want you to be able to analyze the value of reading works about and from each of those classes. To start out, I want to tell you a little story. I am, as some people know, a fan of opera because I am a nerd, and I actually find it interesting to watch a bunch of people sing in a beautiful language that I don't fully understand for 3 hours at a time. But recently, I went to an opera that translated the Shakespearean play Macbeth into an operatic form. And during it, I ran into 4 different classes of something that I'd seen written in a book, and I was stunned by it. It started when I was watching the opera, and I saw a man by the name of Alfred Walker, an incredibly well-respected, renowned, award-winning baritone voice, play the part of Banquo. Now, Alfred Walker is an African-American, but that hasn't stopped him from playing some of the classic parts of operatic history. His biography includes the fact that this year alone, he is traveling to Geneva, Switzerland, Milan, Italy, Paris, France, Cannes, France, and Oslo, Norway, in addition to New York, New Orleans, Boston, Chicago, and obviously Minneapolis, St. Paul. Sitting next to my wife and I were a middle-class African-American couple on a night out. They were there, they were sharing a nice evening, they were watching the opera, they chatted a little bit, but after each act they were out and had a drink and a nice martini. They came back in, they watched more opera, just like everyone else did. The opera was fantastic. I loved every minute of it, as I often do, even if I got a little sleepy at about 11 o'clock when it was wrapping up. And we went outside, and as we walked across the street, I happened to look in and see one of the standard Blue Star cabs that you might see around the Twin Cities, operated largely by our increasing Somali population. A Somali driver behind the wheel picking up people from the Ordway and taking them off wherever they might go. But as my wife and I walked back to where we'd parked our car, we passed a gentleman, another African-American gentleman, who was very upset that we were crowding the sidewalk, that there were so many people coming out. He was dressed very poorly. He looked very much like someone who had fallen on hard times, and he was very upset with the rest of us as he was trying to get to his bus, and he began to spout a variety of sentences, including stupid-ass crackers taking up the whole MF and sidewalk, and continued in this vein as he shoved his way through a crowd of people. And I saw a number of my fellow patrons of the opera looking at this man with fear, disdain, concern. And I realized that in watching that, what I had just seen was 4 classes of African-American people. And it all lined up with a book from the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Eugene Robinson. You might recognize him. He appears often on MSNBC or Meet the Press. And it comes out of his book, Disintegration. And Robinson says that in periods of struggle, we used to be able to identify a single black America. What are the needs of black Americans? This is where the NAACP started. This is where a lot of the civil rights movement started. People were bound together by struggle, and we saw a single sense of one African American identity bound together by struggle. They were united by common interests. What affected one person affected everyone. As Malcolm X pointed out oftentimes in his biography, it didn't matter if you were a doctor, a lawyer, a banker, if you were a bum. Racist people, members of the Klan, still called you the same name. They still called you the N-word. It didn't matter where you were still united in a common interest and a common lack of everything. You were still expected to use separate and unequal facilities. And so things were addressed like that. That racism and equity issue became a rallying cry for everyone, and it really led to a grassroots change. First, when you think about the end of slavery and the attitude of people in escaping from slavery, then in the campaign to end lynching in the early part of the 20th century, and finally in the move for civil rights and more affirmative action, equal opportunities for so many people. But Robinson suggests in his book Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America, that that is no longer the case. Today, Black American is a more complex identity than one universal identity. That the NAACP and other groups that have been dedicated to supporting Black American interests don't have one single set of guidelines or one single identity they're focusing on. In part because, as he points out, struggles are less pronounced. Some people are struggling and some people aren't. Some people are having issues with the way America works and some people have found success within it. We can look at how personal interests outweigh common ones. The community element is less important and less valuable than needing to get yourself personally satisfied and personally taken care of. People are looking after their own interests rather than the community's interests. And of course, we have these vastly different experiences. It's very difficult to say that the man I passed on the street who was swearing and cursing at every honky who was in his way was in the same class as Alfred Walker, the baritone who was finishing up his time in Minneapolis so he could make his way off to Italy. They're not the same person. Their experiences, their backgrounds, their issues, the way they live their lives are vastly, vastly different. And the way we look at them can't be the same in Robinson's expectation, which is where he comes up with his theory of the 4 Black Americas. So you can look at it like this. He suggests that you first start with the abandoned. These are the people who have issues with the way things are, who are not being taken care of or not being addressed. That's the gentleman who was calling the honkies out as they were making his way to the bus difficult. There's the emerging population. This is the largest growing population in America. This is a group of recent African immigrants and mixed race individuals. There's the mainstream individuals that I thought was well embodied by the middle class couple that was with me at the opera, having drinks, having a night out, enjoying the same things that anybody else would enjoy. And then there's that transcendent class, and here is Alfred Walker, traveling around the world, being critically acclaimed, receiving large sums of money for doing what they do and doing it well. Those people seem to be transcendent, in Robinson's opinion. Let's break this down a little bit more, because I don't think I do it justice if I just have it relate to the examples that I saw one night in St. Paul. So think about it like this. You can think of the abandoned as being in an isolated community. They are far removed from the rest of society. They're shuttered off into more segregated areas and communities. They are left alone by and large. They're also impoverished. If we take a look at the general rates of poverty, and this is actually a great statistic right here, poverty by race in 2010, there's a clear gap. 27% of African Americans or Latinos are seen to be in poverty. Only 10% of white Americans are seen to be living in poverty. That's over twice as many people, or in terms of percentages at least. And so the abandoned are living without the money, living without the resources that many other people have. This leads to a lot of issues in terms of how they are approached or how they are addressed within society. Oftentimes they are ignored, and one of the great examples of this is Hurricane Katrina. Kanye West claimed George Bush doesn't care about black people. The fact that so many people were abandoned, left alone, left to struggle, left to fight. Those in the Ninth Ward were not given the same amount of time or opportunity to escape or to get out of New Orleans as other people were. Once they were left in there, awards and awards, support, help coming in from the federal government was mismanaged terribly. They're targeted in some cases. In some cases, politicians make it a rallying cry for a few minutes. They use it as a stepping stone, or they try to get votes by saying that they are closely aligned with it. But the rest of the time, they may well be ignored, and the rest of the populace largely does ignore the plight of the abandoned. This is often seen as a continuation of past experiences. The abandoned have not fully embraced, or not fully, been embraced within the American ideal. Those who struggled through slavery, those who struggled through sharecropping, those who struggled in urban slums and urban centers throughout the early part of the 20th century, in many cases continue to have that struggle, continue to have that issue, and feel like there is no progress, there is no momentum, and so they still see the inequality, the unfairness, the injustice of how our society lives and how our society treats people differently based on their race. Now, that abandoned identity is a commonly seen one, and it's one that is often stigmatized. It's one that's feared. It's one that turns people to think of African Americans with pity rather than appreciation or respect. If all you think about African Americans is what As one community told me when I was interviewing for a job, if you go downtown, you're going to get stabbed or shot. If you go to the Mall of America, you're going to get stabbed or shot because there are too many people of color there. That attitude and idea reflects how people see just abandoned individuals as African Americans. And that ignores another several groups of Americans, especially of African Americans, and that includes the emerging class, as Robinson points out. For Robinson, the emerging is the fastest growing section. That's the immigrant class. And the immigrant class is especially a group coming in from East Africa and northern West Africa. This are Somali individuals, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Senegalese. These are a group of people who are coming into the United States in higher numbers. In recent history, the largest number of legal immigrants into the United States have been African in birth. So this is an incredibly large group. And one thing that's important to note about this emergent class, this immigrant class, is how education-oriented they are. In order to gain access into the United States, the immigrant class that we're seeing currently from Africa had to have a previous education. They were only welcomed into America when it was clear they would be able to stand for themselves, which is why you have the largest number of postgraduate degrees among immigrants in the United States belong to Nigerians. That is the best educated class of immigrants in the country. Not Indians, not Asian Indians, not Japanese, not Chinese. They are Nigerians. That is the largest group of educated immigrants coming into our country. And it's held true by having a cultural value. There's a reason why, if you look around the Twin Cities, there are so many Somalian-focused charter schools, because it's such an important part to that immigrant class. Education is seen as the key for so many people in that community. The emerging class, that immigrant class, also sees greater opportunities for mobility. Coming out of Africa, coming out of systems that often seem unfair and, by many cases, the American abandoned standard, there's a greater opportunity for mobility. You can prove yourself through the education, you can prove yourself through your skills and talents, and reach for a higher level. Great example of this is Barkhad Abdi, the former Minneapolis limo driver who is currently an Academy Award nominee after his role in Paul Greengrass's film Captain Phillips, where he starred opposite Tom Hanks. Abdi has been traveling the world. He's definitely moved far beyond where he was working hard in the Twin Cities into being of an individual who's now having himself chauffeured around London so he can pick up a BAFTA award. It's an amazing opportunity for mobility, but it's not just for the celebrity. It's for lots of people who start businesses and are successful, people who go into banking, who go into academics, and are incredibly successful in their progress. But one thing that's worth noting, too, is that this immigrant class is largely divorced from the race history of Americans here, from African Americans here. This is done beautifully in this painting of a Maasai warrior, contrasted with the baggy black t-shirt that so many people associate with the more abandoned class of African Americans, that's stereotyped. There's a big difference between these two classes. Immigrants from Africa don't necessarily know that they are being associated with African Americans, and African Americans don't necessarily see why they should be lumped together when they have such different backgrounds and such different experiences. This sort of boiled over, many people pointed out last year at a high school in Minneapolis, wherein a massive food fight broke out, and many people blamed long-standing tensions between African immigrant and African American students at the school. Being divorced from the racial history allows that immigrant class to not see some of the same issues that many people who are African American and whose families have been inside our country for a longer stretch of time, hundreds of years or more, to see things differently. Now, in addition to this, we also need to think about the mixed race class. Again, this is the largest growing sector of our population. Rather than saying that we have more Latinos or African Americans or more Asian Americans, what we really have is we have more people who are checking the one or more box within their race when they're asked on surveys. Families are being blended. They're tying together a variety of different cultures. African American traditions and Caucasian traditions, African American traditions and Latino traditions and Asian traditions. Mixed race is coming more and more to the forefront. And this is especially true in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where we are one of the largest communities for mixed race families in the Americas. We blend our families, we blend our history, so it's not uncommon to see both Swedish meatballs and fufu and banku on the same plate at the same meal. And it also allows for families to switch between cultures. Kids who are mixed race or individuals who are mixed race are able to switch between cultures, and they also offer opportunities for different people to switch between cultures. Great example of this is Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York, who married an African-American woman, has mixed-race children. And the entire family has almost choreographed dance moves, including a son who's clearly African-American and has an afro and his own father dancing around excitedly. They switch between cultures. At home, they can have an African-American culture. At the wife's home, they can have an African-American culture. In public, they can be mixed throughout the great diversity of New York City. And with Mayor de Blasio being Italian, they can go into that community as well. They're switching all the time. They're creating their own culture, their own identity. This goes far beyond what we normally assume as an African-American community versus a white community. We don't necessarily see the gaps. We don't necessarily see the distance between one class and another within this emergent class, either because the immigrants are divorced from the race history or because the mixed race individuals are able to switch so easily between the cultures. Now, the emerging class is growing rapidly, but by far, Robinson points out, the largest community in the modern groups of African Americans is the mainstream society. Now, mainstream society is a group of African Americans who are simply incorporated into our broader society. They live in integrated neighborhoods. They have children who attend integrated schools. They are simply part of the fabric of American life. It means that their success is oftentimes institutionalized. Parents and grandparents who have attended college pass it on to their children. It becomes an expectation for the family that you will, not as an African American, be any different than any other African Americans in your family by attending school, by starting a business, by having a job. It's an institution of success. Those who succeeded pass it on to their children. It's seen as what's expected of you, and so it continues on naturally and easily. That institutionalized success is a main factor of the mainstream being seen as simply part of an integrated, well-formed America. One part to this that's also worth noting is that race is often minimized within the mainstream. This is where people tend to adopt ideas of I'm colorblind or I don't really see race. It tends to make it so that there is one African American individual in a community and that their race then doesn't matter, they're just themselves. But race still does matter. You still care about who you are and what your racial identity is, even if you're the only one there. If you're incorporated into the community, it should be respected and valued. But far too often we simply say, well, I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to be colorblind to that. And that's where the issue can really stand out, is whether or not we're really looking at or really understanding what it is to be in the mainstream as an African American if you aren't really like everybody else. It also means that the mainstream is, by and large, oftentimes underrepresented when it comes to artistic representation. There's still a large expectation that things are traditional or that things are the way they were in the past, that people who are in the abandoned sector are the most common. And that means that the mainstream culture, the mainstream class of individuals who are simple, average, middle class, working at Target, working at Best Buy, with college degrees, with homes, with mortgages, who pay their bills and pay their taxes and do everything like average Americans do, are oftentimes underrepresented. Their stories are not fully told within our artistic or our literary communities. It's unfortunate because, as I noted before, the mainstream community is in fact the largest portion of the modern African American community. But our main focus is either on the abandoned or, as Eugene Robinson points out, the transcendent African American community. Now, the transcendent African American community is quite simply the elite African American community. Those people who have come to stand out above and beyond other people, not just of their race, but all kinds of people. They stand out as exemplars of great talent, great skill, great intelligence, or great leadership. President Obama is a tremendous example of the transcendent African American, but so are those who are university presidents, like the gentleman here at Morehouse College. So are those who are easily identifiable, either because of their role in entertainment or in science or in popular culture. Their role, their focus, their power within our community allows them to be easily identified and easily known as household names throughout America. White, Black, Latino, Asian, people know who Oprah Winfrey is or who Whitney Houston is. We know who these individuals are because they are so omnipresent. Their elite status, their presence in the media, their presence in our culture cannot be simplified. So the transcendent are easily noticed, they're easily seen, and they get to control their racial identity. They can make race an issue or they can ignore it. Charles Barkley is a fantastic example of someone who makes his race identity a very focal issue. What he believes and what he thinks is an African American man is at the core of oftentimes what he talks about, even when he's not talking about race. It comes in, it pops up, and he makes that a vital part of who he is. By contrast, Michael Jordan, a great example, probably one of the recent tremendously transcendent individuals in the African American community, really hasn't made his racial identity a focal point. As he famously said in the 90s, I don't participate in politics because Republicans buy sneakers too. The idea and the sense of that came across to a lot of other individuals was that he didn't care about African American issues because he would be willing to endorse or willing to support white Republicans who didn't care or who didn't make comments on African American issues, or who even sometimes espoused racially ambiguous statements about who they cared or who they liked. Michael Jordan is at his liberty to control his racial identity precisely because he's so easily identified. People can look at Michael Jordan and appreciate him as a great basketball player or a star or a legend or someone they truly admire and deem as a hero without ever needing to think of him as a black man. He gets to control his own identity. So does Charles Barkley, so does Oprah Winfrey, so does Barack Obama. They all get to control whether or not they make their own race an issue. It's not minimized as it is for the mainstream people who are often ignored, who have their race ignored by supposedly colorblind mainstream societies. And it's not abandoned people who feel the constant judgment of it. A transcendent individual has the power and control because of their elite, wealthy, easily identifiable, and popular culture status to control how they are seen and what they care to talk about. So, if we think about these four groups, we start to wonder this. When you come into the school, what are we reading? Are we reading stories about the abandoned? Are we reading stories about the mainstream? Are we reading stories about the emerging? Are we reading stories about the transcendent? Where do we see these groups come up? How do these groups interact? How do we appreciate and respect them within our community, within our literary culture, within an academic classroom? What are we reading? Now, in my course, within the first quarter, we are dealing with two individuals I would absolutely qualify as transcendent individuals, Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X. Though interestingly enough, both only became transcendent after struggling through the identity of being abandoned, of being poor, of being a criminal, of being a slave, of struggling tremendously throughout their life. Top Dog Underdog, our most recent piece of reading, really deals in depth with the idea of the abandoned. Both Lincoln and Booth are on their own. They are isolated. They are ignored. And they have felt abandoned, which has pushed them into the situation they're in. A Raisin in the Sun, which we're going to start reading this week, deals far more with a mainstream society. This is before full integration takes effect, so the family unit that we see is a group that has broken into the middle class. It's a group that has wealth and has enough to move into their own home, but is struggling with the issue of how they would become adopted into that community. We'll be looking at poetry, in which we're talking largely again about mainstream experiences, occasionally abandoned issues, occasionally transcendent issues. And our stories, or the short stories that we'll be reading, deal a little bit more in depth with the mainstream society as well. I had a difficult time finding some emerging writers. I'm hoping that I'll have some emerging poets in the near future as well. Next quarter, you're going to get to choose your own piece to read. And you can choose any number of books, and you can think about how exactly that book fits into these four kinds of Americas. Are you reading a book about an abandoned society, a mainstream society, an emerging society, a transcendent society? That's going to be a telling thing. There are pros and cons to reading each kind of story and to reading about books by and about each kind of America. I try to separate it out here by color. I'll use the yellow to talk about, I'll use the blue to talk about transcendent. If you look back, you'll see it's all connected, I promise. If we look at transcendent writers, we're seeing an extremely positive view of success. Education, is the key to all the problems. Both Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X really suggest that. And we take a look at the successful people, we see the positive elements of how African Americans can really succeed. If we look at a mainstream society, we can look at a broadly applicable view of culture. We look at how lots of people can live. It becomes more generalizable rather than individualized. The success of Frederick Douglass might not be easy to repeat for most other people, but the story of Raisin in the Sun is something that we can all appreciate and connect to. If we look at the emerging, we're getting a diverse opinion from within the African community, the African American community. We're getting a view from people who are not wholly consumed by just African American identity and all the historical elements, which allows us to see things in a new light. It gives us a different opinion and a different way to see things. If we read an abandoned text, we start to give a voice to the voiceless. We start to understand and appreciate the struggle and the reality of people who aren't often represented in literature or in the classroom. And that's a tremendous positive as well. But each one of these has a struggle as well. If we only look at the transcendent, we start to skate over some difficult truths about today. The truth is, not everyone is Kanye West. Not everyone is LeBron James. Not everyone is Sidney Poitier or Denzel Washington or Don Cheadle. We have all kinds of different people. And if we only look at the transcendent, we skate over the fact that so many people in African American community still are not that paragon of success that is easy to watch, admire, and listen to racial issues quietly but truthfully. If we listen to the mainstream, we run the risk of seeing a kumbaya perspective that minimizes race. We run the risk of seeing something wherein African Americans are just another group of people, wherein their racial identity is only an issue if they make it an identity, if they are able to struggle against the system. And we're able to see that perhaps race doesn't matter as much as it really does. It runs the risk of saying that everything is okay because we've all reached the same standard of living and that there isn't still a struggle. The issue with the emerging community is that it often ignores the historical context of people's experience. It's difficult for a Somali individual to write about how difficult it is to get ahead in American society because their family's only really been here for maybe 20 years. That's a big difference against people whose families have been struggling against slavery and injustice for the last 200 years. Without that historical context, it's possible to argue that it doesn't fully understand or grasp the meaning of what it is to have an African American experience and write a truly great African American piece of literature. And if we only look at the abandoned, we're run the risk of reinforcing negative perspectives, images, and stereotypes. If all we see are those who struggle, those who are in pain, those who are at a loss, those who are poor, those who are violent, we only see the negative elements. And that's something that can be very harmful to our perspective and our appreciation of what African American culture is today and where African American art and literature is today. So to wrap everything up, you should know the 4 types of Black Americas: the transcendent, the mainstream, the emerging, and the abandoned. You should know and understand that each of these types of Americas has their own history, perspective, and context in modern America. My story of the 4 classes that I saw at the opera really can hit home. You would not confuse Alfred Walker with the Somalian cab driver I saw outside, nor would you confuse the man who'd fallen on hard times with the couple that was drinking martinis. Everyone has their own history, their own perspective, their own context to deal with, and it's important to note each of those. And all of those histories, perspectives, and context comes to bear on works of literature. And that leads to positives and negatives in dealing with all those cultures and all those types of literature. The important thing for you to think about is which one appeals and engages you the most, because it's going to eventually be up to you to think about what you want to read and what you want to argue and discuss as we go further in our writing. Thank you very much for your time and energy today. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.